Hi, everyone. Welcome back to GOPO. Today, we're going to finish up Chapter 3, talking about Sections 3, 4, and 5. We're going to look at how basically federalism developed over time. We're going to look a little bit back to the history, and then we're going to look at modern day examples of it. And usually, when there's debates between the national and state governments and they're feuding, it goes to the courts. So, the very first time there was ever a feud between the national and the state governments that went to the courts, which was McCulloch versus Maryland, which is one of our 15 cases. So basically, the second bank of the United States had a branch in Maryland, and Maryland didn't really want it there. They wanted to do their own taxes and their own laws, and they just refused to be bothered with the second bank. So it went to the court, and they said, "Is the national bank constitutional? Is it can a state tax that bank?" And the decision was, yeah, the bank was constitutional. Congress had the power to do this because of the supremacy clause. So the result was the national government won over the state government when there was a conflict, and it established the supremacy clause as national government will win. So this wasn't the only time this happened. This was John Marshall who was in charge of this court, and during his court, he did this, and it would give them, the national government, more power, not only with this first use of the supremacy clause, but also with this next case, Gibbons versus Ogden, which is similar. Basically, two men had a license to operate business on the Hudson River, one from New Jersey, one from New York, and they were arguing over who had the power over it because Hudson River splits New York and New Jersey. So they took it to the court, and the court ruled in favor of Thomas Gibson because they said the federal license is more important than a state license. Therefore, the federal government has more power in this situation, which is commerce, which is trade, but they even expanded the government's power over trade between states just to mean business activity. So again, because of the Commerce Clause, they got more and more power. So at the beginning of the country, the national government has a lot of power. And then comes some more amendments that were created at the national level because this is in the U.S. Constitution, so it's meant to be for the national government in the country. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the Civil War amendments. So the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th, which is definitely the most important amendment in the U.S. Constitution, and we'll see that throughout the entire class, is that it says, if you were born in the United States, you are a citizen or naturalized, you are a citizen of the United States, and you have due process and equal protection under the law. Due process means if you ever get in trouble, you have the right to defend yourself and get a trial and all that kind of stuff to make sure that you can prove your innocence. 15th Amendment was universal male suffrage. You can vote regardless of, if you're a man, regardless of your race. So with that, this is when we're going to see some state conflicts because there's going to be the Jim Crow South who starts creating their own state laws that definitely go against these amendments. And one of the biggest ones is when we start seeing separate facilities, public facilities and private, for Black and white people in the South. So this came to a head with the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where there was a man by the name with Plessy who was basically he was not allowed to ride on a train car, a white train car, because he was 1/8 Black, and in the eyes of the law in the South, he was all Black. So he took it to the court and said, this is unconstitutional, it violates the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court said, separate but equal is constitutional. You can have separate facilities and train cars and accommodations as long as there's an equal, they're equal. Well, the South took that as equal amount, and they enforced this, but they did not provide the same quality. And it just strengthened. Now, this is an example where the state governments got more power over the national governments. For the longest time throughout history, moving on to the different types of federalism we've seen, we see that the country mostly up until about the Great Depression had what was known as dual federalism, where think of it as like a layered cake. Like here's one layer of chocolate, here's vanilla. They don't intermix. This is the state level, this is the national level. They do their own things without really intermixing or being involved in each other's business at all. But it became cooperative federalism, especially around the time of the Great Depression. Those distinctions became blurred. States' rights were undermining selective incorporation, were undermined with selective incorporation, because what was happening was the Supreme Court kept saying, you see these rights that are in the federal government, they can be selected to be incorporated at the state level. So the Supreme Court was saying these things that you guys have been able to get away with, you can't get away with them anymore, and it takes power away from the states. A really good example of that is Gideon versus Wainwright. Gideon got in a bar fight. He didn't have a lawyer, and he was in a state court in Florida. And they said, you can't, he's like, I can't afford a lawyer. I'm poor. And they're like, well, too bad. And he's like, and then when he was in jail, he's like, now, wait a minute. Don't I have the right to counsel? It says that in the Sixth Amendment. And the state of Florida was like, no, you don't, because this is a state case, not a federal case. And the Supreme Court went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said, we select the right to a lawyer in the Sixth Amendment to be incorporated at all the states. So now all state courts had to provide public defenders, which they never had to in the past. So it takes away power from the states. So it limits them because they're told whatever's in the federal national constitution they have to do when the Supreme Court makes those decisions. So we start seeing this move away from dual federalism, where people can make and states can make their own decisions, to cooperative, almost like think of it as like a marble cake mixed together. And it's good and bad. You know, you can see that states are told what to do. They might not like that with selective incorporation, but at the same time, they really like it when the federal government works with the states by providing them funds for projects they want to do. So like I said, this really happened with the Great Depression. States really were were in dire straits. They needed help. And with FDR's policy of Keynesian economics, where it's the idea of the government spends and spends and spends to lift up the economy, it was also spending at state projects. And this is where the government stepped in and became more involved nationally at the state levels by giving them money. And the states were like, we will definitely accept your financial aid. We need the help, but there's a cost to it. So what's the cost? Well, the federal government has more control over what the states can do. And this permanently altered the relationship between the state and national government, because even after the Great Depression ended, those federal programs stayed in the states. Probably, you saw the alphabet soup in APUSH in U.S. history. Probably one of the most famous ones is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the government gave money to the states around the Tennessee Valley to create dams and electricity for those areas that were having problems. It still exists today. It's still a federal entity that's having some control over those states. So I'm going to skip through this. Now we're going to look at, so we got through the Great Depression. We see what cooperative federalism looks like. Now we're going to look at modern day federalism, which is basically still cooperative federalism, but it's known more as fiscal federalism. Because why? They want the money. States wants the money, and the federal government's like, we'll give it to you. So this tool by the federal government is known as grant and aid, where they're giving money to the states that for specific policy objectives. There's different types, though. There's the categorical ones are the ones that are super specific, that they have to do it a certain way. So a good example is, let's say the CARES Act. The federal government said to our district, here's money but you have to use it to buy laptops for your school and to buy proper cleaning supply and PPE for your school. So that's an example because of the COVID crisis. That's an example of a categorical grant. It's very specific on what the money has to be used for. And this is known as fiscal federalism, where the government gives money to the states and they use it to whatever project they can. But this is the federal government's way of influencing what goes on in the states. So it takes away some of the power from the states. But the states are kind of okay with it because they're getting money. They're getting federal money. But sometimes, every now and then, the federal government says, states, you have to do this, but we're not going to give you any money for it. And probably the most famous example, and it's the one I'm telling you, if there's ever a question about unfunded mandates, this is the answer you give, is Americans with Disabilities Act. So in 1990, they passed this act, and they said all public places have to provide handicap accessible accommodations for every place, and you don't get money for it. The states didn't get any money for it. They have to do it or they get in trouble. They get fined. Um, an example would be, think about this: every public building, they have to have wheelchair ramps if they didn't have them before, and they have stairs, or parking spots, or bathroom accommodations like bathroom stalls. It gets really expensive, and the government said you have to do it or else. Um, so this political cartoon is kind of giving you an idea of what fiscal federalism is like today, where Uncle Sam, if you ever see Uncle Sam in a cartoon, is representing the national government of the United States. Okay, so just always know that. And they're throwing aid to help the states who are drowning in debt. But if you notice the aid, what is it? It looks like, oh, help me, but it's a cinder block, which will weigh down the states even more. And it's more of the burden of losing the power over what they have. And there is a cost. It might not be actual cash cost, but it's going to cost them some of their power. And you can see over time that the money, this is time down here, and how much money that the government is giving in federal grants from 1990 to 2012. They've been getting more and more money over time. This part right here, this was when the economy was doing really, really well, so they weren't necessarily in need of that. But even though I'm like making the national government look like this like big bad guy, there's times where the national government still gives money to the states and gives power back to the states with this. This is known as devolution, the idea where the national government returns authority to state and local governments. That's very common all over the world. The UK is really involved in devolution right now as well. And one way they do that is with block grants. Now, block grants are grant and aid, just like a categorical grant, but they're broad of what they can do. So it's not a blank check. Revenue sharing is a blank check. This is, you have a broad thing you can use it for. So like, for instance, when I was talking about the CARES Act, and it said that's a categorical grant because it says here's the money from the federal to the states, but you have to use it for laptops and cleaning supplies for schools. A block grant would just be like, here's money from the national government for education to a state. That's very broad. It does have a purpose. It does have a specific category but it's just education. Okay. It's not, nitty gritty of specific things for education. Now, revenue sharing is just basically money with no strings attached. It's way too costly, and the federal government loses control over what the states can do, so they don't really do it. But every now and then it was done, especially in the past. Another, probably the most famous example of devolution would be the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Whew, that's a mouthful. And TANF. Basically, this was done in the 90s under Bill Clinton, and he basically said, okay, states, here's money for welfare. You have the authority of what to do over it. But the states had to, the string attaches, they had to place limits on how much welfare people could get and for how long. Now, another example of how federalism has affected you, but how it's turned over time, is with public education. So in the 1960s, the national government started to get a little bit involved with education because that is one of those reserve powers that really the states are the ones that have power over is education. But they creepily got more involved over time. And then with George W. Bush, son Bush, they passed the No Child Left Behind Act, which said, here's money, states, but you have to follow all these specific testing, and the school has to get a certain grade, and they have to keep creeping up every year. And it was very controversial because it gave the national government way too much power over an entity that really is power that's reserved for the states and the local governments. So that one went kind of on the wayside. And as you can see, elementary school, this is just an example, this map of how schools are so different per state. Every state spends money differently on education because they get to decide that. So it's hard to enforce a national standard to follow in education when you're holding someone like Arizona the same accountability as New York, who spends very differently on education. All right. And then the last thing I'm going to show you about how the Supreme Court has been involved recently with federalism. This case, United States versus Lopez, is one of your required 15 cases for the course. So the background information is this. Alfonso Lopez, he brought a gun to school and was charged with violating the Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990. Okay, we know you can't bring a gun to school. But here's the thing. He got in trouble by the FBI. They came and arrested him later and charged him for a federal crime when really he was breaking the like a state rule. Okay, so the question was, is this gun-free zone school zone act unconstitutional because it gives too much power to the national government? It was a commerce clause question. It wasn't a gun question. It was he bought the excuse was they arrested the FBI arrested him because he bought the gun out of state. Okay, so are they over um, superseding their powers as a national government, saying they can arrest him because he violated the Commerce Clause and they have power with the Commerce Clause? And the court said they voted against it. They said the possession of a gun in a local school isn't an economic activity that the national government has to get involved in because it's not really commerce. So why this was such a big deal? Why is this case so big of a deal? Because this is one of the times where we see the states get power over the national government. This said, this is not a time, the FBI cannot come in and arrest somebody. States can arrest them for bringing a gun to school, but the FBI cannot do that because they're violating a state's rights to do that. This has nothing to do with commerce like the national government was trying to say it did. So this was one of those things where the state governments actually got power over the national governments, and that's why it's one of the top 15 cases. So for this chapter, you're going to see two of the top 15 cases. I'm trying to do 15 right there. McCullough versus Maryland and United States versus Lopez. They're both about federalism. The difference is McCullough says if there's the conflict between the national and the state governments, the national government rules, and they said it in the name of the supremacy clause. In U.S. versus Lopez, they said, no, actually, the states rules in this case because they can't take guns away from people in the name of commerce. And that's one. So they had the opposite effect. There's also been some cases lately about same-sex marriage because for a while, each state got to decide on marriage rules. And in this case, in United States versus Windsor, a same-sex couple was married and Thea passed away. Edith had to pay a bunch of taxes. And if they were opposite sex couple, would she have had to do that? So basically, was the Defense of Marriage Act, which was saying that marriage has to be between a man and a woman, is that constitutional? And it said in a 5-4 vote that the section of Defense of Marriage Act classifying only opposite sex marriages as legal was unconstitutional under federal law. So the moral story is the federal law can't infringe upon a marriage as a state power. So this was giving power back to the states too. So like she was getting charged a federal estate tax. She can't do that because that violates her constitutional right. But this was the big one. This is the one that and this is one of the 15. This is one of the ones that you heard about the most. This is the one that said same-sex marriage is constitutional because a gay couple in Maryland got married in Maryland, even though they're from Ohio. And when they went back to Ohio, who did not recognize same-sex marriage, they said that violates our constitutional right. But the state said, no, each state decides marriage laws, and Ohio decides that, gay same-sex marriage is not allowed. And the court ruled 5-4, so it's controversial. Anytime you see a 5-4 vote, it's a controversial vote. But they ruled in favor. Same-sex marriage, like that is constitutional. That is their civil liberty. They have the right to privacy. They have that civil right. They are protected under the 14th Amendment. And Justice Kennedy basically said the right to marry is a fundamental right inherent in the liberty of a person. So this was the one that allowed same-sex marriage. States tried to fight it, and this case, the national government said, we select your right to privacy and the 14th Amendment's right to protection under the law, that same-sex marriage is incorporated in all states. So it did take power away from the states, but it provided a huge change and win for civil rights. And then how does that case that I talked about at the beginning about the two people growing medical marijuana and how they took it to the court? Well, they were basically saying, do they have the right to do that? Because California says they do, even though the national government says they don't. And in a 6-3 decision, they said the federal government can control that because it is interstate commerce. So ultimately, the federal government, according to this case, if they ever wanted to, if people wanted to take this to the courts, could step in and say that all sales and growing of marijuana is illegal and it's unconstitutional for states to violate that. Why isn't that being done? Simple, because people aren't taking it to court. So if people take it to court, this case shows that in Gonzalez versus Rake, that the federal government will most likely win. This is just showing states in here that allow it for medicinal, recreational use. It's a teeny bit outdated because we just got this in January. We are dark green now. We are one of the states that allows it for recreational use too. All right, so I hope you guys can understand how federalism works, especially seeing with the real life examples and knowing what you've seen so far. That's it for chapter 3. I hope you have a wonderful day. Talk to you later.